Good to be with everybody. I'm Andy Dale. I'm the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at OpenAP, which is a joint venture owned by some large media companies, NBC Universal, Paramount, Fox, and Warner Brothers Discovery. Prior to that, I was General Counsel and Head of Privacy at several advertising and marketing tech companies. In addition to that, I'm an advisor to Athena, particularly around the privacy training and that side of things. But I met the team and just really enjoyed and fell in love with what they were building. So I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about getting compliance programs going. And I'm happy to talk with the folks from Athena. So let me take a minute and introduce them. Actually, I'll introduce them and then maybe they can describe what they do a little better than I can try to do that. So starting with Alana Marinello, once you start first.
Thanks so much, Andy. Hi, everyone. I am Alana. I am a customer success manager here at Athena. So I work with all of our enterprise customers here. I am kind of a long-term strategic partner, working with our customers from the very beginning, from implementation on through the duration of our partnership, really specifically focused on getting to high completion, understanding what metrics are most affecting your program, how to kind of pivot and adjust your program as your organization evolves, and come from more of an ed tech background, having previously worked at spots like IDOU and Udacity. So very interested and excited about the overlap of training, L&D, and the people space, and legal as well.
Nice. Thank you. Lauren?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Barakat. I am the implementation team lead here at Athena. So in my role, I lead our implementation function as well as support. So in practice, I am sort of the hands-on manager of all enterprise launches here at Athena, helping to craft a project plan and keeping both customers and internal Athena teams on track for successful launches. And I'll also oversee onboarding for customers of all sizes, as well as technical support, integrations, all that good stuff. I'm based in New Jersey, and prior to Athena, I've worked in customer success and implementation at a number of organizations, including LinkedIn Learning on the EdTech side. So happy to be here.
Thank you. You're already getting shout outs in the chat too about how easy and wonderful you are to work with. So starting off strong. All right, so we're gonna have a couple general questions that we'll put out there, and you can give your thoughts and feelings into the chat, and hopefully we can maybe incorporate them. That first question is, what's your biggest hurdle when launching a successful compliance program? So start, if you can, share challenges and things that have been difficult, and if we can touch on them throughout the discussion, we'll try to do that. So what are the biggest hurdles? All right, so starting here, I want to ask, in terms of selection, starting with Alana, maybe, what are the biggest things in terms of selecting a compliance vendor? What do people look for? What are they worried about? What are they concerned about? And then how long should that period take of selection?
That is a great question. So we see customers looking for a lot of different components as they're selecting a compliance training vendor and thinking about how to set themselves up for long-term success. I think one of the key things that folks are looking for is seamless integrations. There can be so much manual work behind the scenes in setting up a compliance program, that integrations can take a lot of that off the admin side plate. And thinking about like how automated assignments get assigned to different populations, especially in the case of harassment prevention. We also see a lot of folks as they're looking at the vendor selection process, think about like, what does the content look like? How engaging is it? How much does it feel like it would lead to high efficacy and behavior change, specifically when we think about important topics like compliance in the workplace and how they affect culture. Folks also tend to be looking for what assignment functionality looks like, what does the learning center look like, and what does admin capability look like on the back end, especially when being able to get a very quick bird's eye view of stats and reporting to be able to share with leadership or to be able to do escalation. So I think across systems and content and integrations, those all tend to be some of the most important factors, both in the beginning and down the line as we're looking toward high completion.
So maybe for Lauren too, how do you find people are prioritizing those? I mean, you just listed a lot of things that all seem very important in the selection process. How do you help people prioritize based on their business needs, maybe?
Yeah, I would say it varies a lot by organization. I think some of the big drivers are size of organization, right? Maturity of their compliance program or their learning program. So, a good example, the first thing Alana mentioned is integrations. If you have a really robust technical team who is on hand to support integrations, you might not be so worried about like the time it might take because you feel confident that they'll be able to get things set up quickly and will kind of be competent in helping you automate things on their end. If you are a team of one and you need to set up the integrations yourself with whatever level of technical knowledge you might have, you don't necessarily have time to go in and do manual work if that's required to support your program. You want to make sure that you can really just, click a few buttons and be done. And that might be the most important thing. Whereas I'd say at larger organizations, what might be more important is making sure that the content feels really relevant and on brand for your company, right? You have a very specific brand voice that's echoed throughout your internal communications, and you want to make sure that your training reflects that. So those are kind of some of the main levers that I think of. Alana, feel free to chime in if you have any additional ones.
I think one of the interesting things about Athena in general is that uh, the ICP, if you will, is pretty wide. Like you can fit with enterprise, you can fit with mid-market, SMB. I'm a little off script here, but why not? So Alana, like, how do you think about the variance of the client and their specific needs in terms of tailoring what might be best for them? Because an SMB person might be ready to go in and get started and go do things themselves, and they may want to do that. But there may be things that maybe they're not aware of that maybe they should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think as best as possible, we try to tailor the implementation and onboarding experience, as well as kind of the long-term success of the program to whatever the size of the organization is. And what that means is like we're also trying to work within what we understand to be the confines or the goals of your organization. So like to Lauren's point, if you're a team of one, we're going to help structure an onboarding process that like puts the least load on you, helps like understand the systems and framework within which you're working, versus if you're like a large enterprise customer and you have a large technical team, maybe you have folks who are working with you on the implementation side. We'll start kind of building out an implementation plan and long-term solution in terms of like follow-up and who you're engaging based on what size you are. So like one small example of that is if you're thinking about a program that's already launched and the escalation process that you need to employ, we're going to have very different recommendations for a larger team that's reaching out to thousands of employees, like maybe engaging HRBPs, leaning more on managers versus a SMB company where maybe direct outreach is a little bit more feasible to individuals who have not yet completed. But I think across the board, there are still some kind of higher level strategies and themes that we see, honestly, regardless of size, that we also just try to share with customers across the board around like how people react to deadlines, best time to launch, and things like that.
We already have a bunch of questions here, so maybe I'll interrupt the flow just for a minute. All right, so any suggestions on handling specific team or departments that are like resistant to training, don't have time? Maybe Lauren, this is could be in the implementation phase. So what do you recommend there on, maybe it's a little bit of a harder implementation?
Totally. Yeah, I think that comes up very often. There tends to be one department that usually our customers can call out on the kickoff call of like, we will have trouble getting the engineering team to complete their training. Like that just is what it is. It happens whenever we launch a training. So having that knowledge up front is really helpful. So you can kind of design around that. And there are a couple things that we usually recommend to combat that. So one is, if it's really a time issue, make sure that you are actively carving out the time for your team to complete their training. So we've seen a lot of companies, including Athena internally, actually be really effective with carving out like a calendar block on people's schedules and making sure that you're actually holding the company to it, right? Like these are the 2 hours you have to complete your compliance training. Like, go. We're not going to schedule any internal meetings. Your tickets can wait until after this period, and kind of building that into the culture can really help combat the excuse of like, hey, we don't have time for this. And beyond that, I think making sure that the leadership of those teams are really bought in on the value of training and also potentially the risks of not training and kind of like the impacts that that can have on the company as well.
How do you do that? Like, who do you partner with in the organization to do that? Well, one of the related questions here is um, trying to avoid training fatigue, and I've lived this as many people have. Like, I've been in big companies, and they can be really long and cumbersome, and I don't want to use the word boring, but they can be dry, And so like I really like that's one of the areas where you all focus on combating that that historical maybe that historically the way some of those things have looked. So how do you both um get away from the fatigue if you can, and also kind of get the leadership buy-in? Because I think those things are related in some ways. Maybe a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think on the fatigue spot, and we can dig deeper into this, it really depends what your rollout strategy is. So we can see like typically organizations react differently to having like, one training released every single month versus like a lot of training released all at once versus batching rollouts throughout the year during key times. We find that there's a lot of training fatigue typically if you're rolling out, say, ad hoc training right before a perf cycle or right before the end of quarter when everyone in sales is all, completely underwater, and adding your training just ends up compounding that. So we do really recommend having a very intentional rollout strategy so that folks are receiving their training either all at once or in these kind of determined periods of time throughout the year. So that they don't feel like they're just always kind of weathering an onslaught of training consistently throughout the year. Another piece is, again, like having those conversations with leadership, whether it's the person managing the program or the person managing the program is kind of getting buy-in from one person on the leadership to communicate to leadership more broadly. Typically, you want to have an exec champion who understands the value of training. We see that completion is much, much higher when we have executive buy-in, both in, understanding the fact that there are consequences to the company if training is not completed, but there's also really positive cultural implication when leadership shows up and shows that they care about the value of the training. So finding either an exec champion or a direct line to leadership to be able to communicate that, we find could be extremely helpful.
Lauren, what things do people miss when they onboard? What are they not thinking about? Are there common things that they're maybe less focused on where you sort of steer the conversation into certain areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I think what Alana just spoke to around the cadence that you're rolling out your courses in and how that relates to your company's internal calendar is huge. Like that's really the crucial thing, making sure that the training is coming out at a time that works well for your teams so that you have less people falling back on that excuse of like, oh, this is a really hectic time for our sales. We're not going to be able to get to it this quarter or whatever it may be. So being really thoughtful about the launch date, but also about the length of deadline that you're giving, right? Is this something that you want people to complete within a month? Is this something you want people to complete within 6 months? And making sure not only the length of that, but also the deadline date, right? So you might be really thoughtful of like, October is a great time to launch for our business, but if your deadline date is December 31st, you're not going to have a lot of people online and completing their training in the last week of the year. So making sure that you're really thoughtful around the scheduling of both the initial launch date as well as the deadline is key. Making sure that it's at a time, again, that you can carve out time in your learners' calendars. and making sure that you're selecting the right audience. I find that this is the piece that for a lot of my customers can be kind of a last minute decision of like, oh gosh, should contractors get this training? What type of contractors? Who's taken this training recently? How should we handle them? When those are really going to be key pieces in first making sure that your training is successful, that you need to make minimal adjustments after the fact, and that you can kind of benefit from that like set it and forget it mindset from your assignments, and that your learners are getting the best experience.
Is the goal, do most people have the goal to get to 100%? Like when they roll something out, is the goal every single person in the company should do this, or do you kind of guide people to go incremental, get the training muscle built up, and then shoot for it in year two? I mean, this is going to sort of depend on company size, and having been in both very large and medium and small businesses, it varies, I can say that, but I'd be interested in your experience. Alana, I know you probably have some thoughts on that too.
Totally, yeah. I mean, we know that everyone always wants to aim for 100%, and we highly encourage you, like shoot for the stars, go for the 100. I think like the real answer to that is it depends on what you're benchmarking internally and your tolerance for risk. We find that it also really depends on the industry you're coming from. Like, for example, a lot of my customers in the fintech space have a no questions asked, we must be at 100% every single year. It doesn't matter if it's our first year or our second year. We have other customers who say, look, we're benchmarking toward early 90%. If we can get higher, that's even better, but here's where we were last year. Here's where we're looking to get this year. So I think it also depends on the culture of your organization. Some of our customers are not within fintech and they might be in a totally different industry, but there's just a no questions asked requirement with very heavy consequences should you not complete your training. So it's a very culturally dependent answer. But at the end of the day, we know everyone is aiming for as high as possible. We encourage as high as possible, and we will do our very best to help you get as close to 100% as you can, but it'll vary based on kind of industry and tolerance for risk.
How do you consider that in the beginning, Lauren, when implementing a customer? Like, are you going at it from 100% first, or are you sort of reacting to what the customer's story is?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll always ask in our initial conversation with a customer, like, what is your target, right? And we'll try to match that. Many customers say 100% right off the bat. Many are realistic and they say typically by the deadline date, we get to, let's say, 80%. And then we know we'll spend the next month or so chasing individuals who didn't get to it in time. So, like, that's the ideal, right? Where it's kind of built into their expectations and the process. But we absolutely kind of adjust expectations based on where the customer is at, and we'll build our follow-up plan accordingly. So I know we have in a slide here an example of what Alana will sometimes share 30 days post-launch on like kind of the first engagement touch point to review data. And you'll see here, we try to lay out very clearly, like based on your completion, right? These three departments are the ones that aren't completing their training. Here's exactly how we would recommend combating that, and knowing like 100% by deadline is always the goal, but it is pretty rare. So this is how we'll try to partner with our customers to chase down that final 20% or whatever amount it might be at your organization.
One of the things that I think makes Athena unique, right, is the approach in general, and the approach to consequences, or the approach to follow-up and communications around completion is an interesting angle. I've been part of highly regulated businesses, so broker-dealer, credit card company, all of which had, the very clear mandate of 100% compliance across the board, thousands and thousands of employees globally, and the way that's achieved is, you know, tons of automated reminders and threats, and and just like lots and lots and lots of these different mechanisms to require this. So how does Athena look at that? Because you have a unique lens kind of on your approach in general. So I'm curious, what do you think about in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Lauren, I wonder if you could share screen and share our consequences
Yeah.
for disengaged learners.
So sorry, I thought I was sharing when I was showing this great post-launch engagement plan you made, Alana.
Well, we can all take a moment to bask in the glory of this as well. But this is what Lauren was speaking to earlier around targeted follow-up engagement strategies based on some of the early data that comes through after your deadline passes. And I think to your point, Andy, we find that we have these conversations early on to what Lauren was speaking to, where we're asking, like, what is your goal for completion? What are you aiming toward from a benchmarking standpoint? And the same goes for what is your policy or what is your culture around consequences and escalation for folks who have not yet completed their training. We find that it varies a lot, again, depending on organizational culture, a lot of times depending on what kind of industry you're in or what size you are. But our approach is to kind of recommend a laddered tier of consequences that you can employ as levers, depending on how far overdue a learner is and what your company's tolerance is for kind of the more heavy side of the consequence ladder. In the very beginning, starting with lighter consequences, firm messaging, messages that say, like, this is extremely important to the business. These are, X, Y, and Z reasons why it's important that you complete your training. We've noticed that you haven't yet completed it, which sometimes can just go a long way in itself. And then from there, laddering up to manager escalation. Within Athena, we have a tool built in to start notifying managers once the deadline's passed so that they can take an active role in helping drive completion. And then from there, thinking about higher consequences like suspending IT access, escalating to leadership, and at the very end, sometimes they're including in your performance review. And then at the very end, kind of essentially making completion a condition of your employment. So obviously you can see there's an extremely wide range here of the different types of consequences that you can employ. But we recommend starting light and then kind of going heavier as
I've
needed.
been in a company where you don't get your bonus paid.
That's a great example right there. Yeah,
Yep.
I think that would probably be a pretty heavy driver for you to
That's the very end of the spectrum. All right. So let's do one more another pulse question we have, like, for everybody. So if you can weigh in the Q&A or in the chat if you like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how onerous is it on your team to get to that high completion? So 1 very easy, 5 very difficult. I'm gonna guess that we're gonna see answers that either are in the middle or in the difficult piece. I think very easy would be a wishful thinking to get ones. Maybe there's some organizations. Have you all found any organizations that really find it snappy and easy to get to high completion rates? Maybe not.
Mackenzie,
Previously
just
one.
because you're my customer, can I call on you and ask you to share a little bit more context?
Yeah, please.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Lauren. Lovely to see you. I'm Mackenzie. I'm one of our people operations specialists here at Matterport. We have been working with Athena on the implementation for many, many months. It was a long process. We actually had a reduction in force even happen throughout the implementation. We had to delay all sorts of things. So I can't speak highly enough of the company and all the people, especially Lauren. But we were using mTrain previously. We had to make every single notification. We had to make even the titles of the training, like nothing was automated. Nothing was already set up. Every single outreach we had to do was manual. You couldn't CC managers. I mean, it was the worst. So I have been so excited. We've only been using Athena since just I think about the start of January, but it has been a total 180 for us in being able to have reminders sent out in one-click reminders. So can't speak highly enough.
Thanks, Mackenzie.
Yeah, that's a nice shout out. Thank you.
Shauna, would you mind sharing why it's very difficult in your opinion?
Hey there. Am I on camera? I don't know.
You have
I'm
a
sure
really
everyone has
cool
seen, I
image.
don't know if you guys have seen them, but it's rolling around Instagram and there's different memes going on. I'm sure you've seen them about how basically impossible it is for managers to accept like exceeds or setting new standard expectations or ratings I mean, at this point, they're like, well, if you're meeting expectations, that means you're doing your job and you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. It's like, well, you've got people that are working, 60 hours a week and as far as I'm concerned, exceeding expectations. But anyway, I think it's funny. It's almost impossible to get anything above a meets.
So maybe this question for Alana. How have you seen companies use Athena to boost morale, and how has that worked effectively, and what strategies are tied to that? Because like we'd love to I'd like to move towards like a discussion that is less about the consequences for not doing something and more about what value are people getting from Athena, which has a different approach than I think other compliance tools.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think even just from the baseline competition side of things, once you're kind of like looking toward the edge side of, the latter half of your completion, we have had a lot of customers who engage in friendly competition to make sure that their teams are completing ahead of other teams, and it ends up kind of like shifting morale to a we can do this versus a like this is an extremely onerous thing that's quite annoying that we actually have to do. And one way, this is getting a little sidetracked, but just kind of from a morale standpoint, one way we find that being pretty successful is to replace, not add, training blocks on calendars. So say you have like an all hands that happens every single week, and you decide to replace that all hands with a training block. All of a sudden, you're not like adding more to an employee's plate, you're replacing something that already exists. And that ends up kind of like detracting from the this feels really frustrating standpoint.
Lauren, Lauren, in the implementation phase, how do you, if someone comes in and they're like, I'm here, I like Athena, but like I don't like this, it's hard to do. How am I going to get everyone to do it? It's really difficult. How do you what are you saying, to help turn that around?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think most of our new customers hopefully like came to Athena with kind of like a glimmer of hope in their eyes, right? I think something that can really like naturally combat morale is if the training that you're actually putting in front of your team members is enjoyable and engaging. So I think for a lot of new Athena customers, it's kind of like reminding them of that and helping them craft a message to their team members that kind of like conveys that same excitement and tone. So on our end, we have a lot of great templates that we share with our admins to then share with their team that really mirrors, it's got GIFs in it and like fun language to really drive home like this is a really important training and we'll touch on some really serious issues, but we want to make sure that we're having fun while we're doing it and that we're spending your time valuably. So really just like hammering home that message from our kickoff call to the learner communications and through our follow-up as well, it has really been the most important thing to make sure we're like truly living, in our case, like the Athena value. But I think the same thing could be true with any compliance training, right? Making sure that you're explaining why it's relevant to the company and to the individual.
Yeah, and a piece I'll add on there, I think that's a great answer, Lauren, is that like we can't speak enough for the value of like the content speaking for itself too, because I think a lot of people when they receive Athena content, they start seeing relevant examples that actually pertain to how, they're interacting in the workplace. And we have a lot of teams reach out to us and say like, we had people give us positive feedback on our training for the very first time. And usually, hearing like this training was fine is like positive in a compliance training setting. But in general, we find that like once folks dive in, the communication is super important up front. But once folks dive in, feeling like the examples speak to them, like there's humor embedded, and it feels like it's kind of a more engaging experience at the onset, it tends to kind of shift morale in itself.
How are you getting to leadership role? Like in some of these cases, you're probably getting a variety of different folks doing the initial engagement, depending on the company size, scale, interest level of the person. How are you working with, customers to get that not just buy-in, but sort of endorsement or support from, maybe it's the head of people, head of legal, CMO, whatever. How are you getting the message about that filtered up through those channels, or what are you doing to do that? Maybe Alana first.
Yeah, I mean, we'll do a lot of this in our post-launch check-ins where we will invite those leaders to our calls themselves and say, look where you are post-launch. Look how this compares to the previous provider you were using, or look how this compares specifically in the data to all the outreach you did. Like you can see the spike in completion based on this comm you set out or these automated reminders that went out. And we're sharing the sentiment that comes through from learners directly within the platform. But a lot of the times we're bringing those people to the table to speak directly to us so that we can share the impact that Athena has had, how their training's going. And we'll also make reporting super, super simple for our admins to be able to pull completion reporting, filter by, specific department, and share up to leadership to say, like, look, your department's doing an amazing job. We have a template for you to send to this leader to say, like, please do a little bit more to help engage this department.
That's an underrated playbook. Metrics, data, coming with value, and then engaging another group around that same value prop works everywhere, but certainly works with what you're describing. Lauren, there's a question in the Q&A that I think would be good for you to answer potentially. It says, any recommendations for engaging business owners, legal, InfoSec, others to own more of the end-to-end process? For example, as the learning team, they require business owners craft written communications to their teams. That's escalations for delinquents. Maybe a different term for that, but that kind of thing. So how do you work with folks on like engaging the business across different business units?
Totally. First of all, the term we use for delinquents is cheeky learners at Athena. But totally hear the sentiment. And I actually think that my advice here is very similar to what Alana was just saying that we do for our admins in terms of like providing templates and really just like taking the guesswork out of it for these leaders, right? Anything that you're giving to a business owner that's going to put more work on their plate or that they feel like they have to start from scratch with is going to go to the bottom of their list, right? It's just going to be harder for them to actually get it done or to see the importance of. So if you send a template and say, hey, please send this to your team member, like please send this to these 5 team members who haven't yet completed their training, that can take all the guesswork out of it for them. They can copy and paste, and it just makes it as simple as possible. And of course, going back to what we said earlier, like include the importance to the business when you're trying to convince a leader of something like that, right? Here are the actual risks to our business that could incur by, these number of people being incomplete with their training.
Yeah. I'm trying to see if there's more. I think there's a few more in the chat here. Oh yeah. What do you think, longer or shorter deadlines for training? Does that depend on the type of training itself or the customer or the kind of individual goals, what they're after? Is that unique, or are there like best practices or guidelines there?
Yeah, I would say
Go ahead, Lauren.
feel free to chime in. I feel like there are a couple different factors here. Definitely the actual training is a big factor and what it means to your company specifically, right? So harassment prevention, it's kind of a two-sided coin of there are requirements in certain locations to get the training done within a certain amount of days. So most of our customers won't go beyond a certain number of days to make sure they're staying within the legal requirements for certain states like New York. But at the same time, it's a longer training. So most of our customers will kind of like toe that line of like they want to give their learners as long as possible, but maybe not too long that they're creeping into like, okay, now someone can go 4 months into hire without getting that content. Whereas for shorter trainings or other trainings, it can kind of depend on the content And for instance, I think like cybersecurity and data privacy at certain companies, they have requirements related to SOC 2 or other measures where they have to complete training upon like 2 weeks of new hire, right? That's going to set that deadline. Whereas other ones, it might just be a case of like, hey, how important is this? And also to get back to our kind of like training rollout strategies, I'll share my screen with this slide. A lot of our customers who take more of this like batched rollout approach will set standard deadlines, right? So if you're doing like a quarterly rollout of like 2 courses a quarter or something like that, you might just want to clean like 60 or 90-day deadlines. So you're like in this standard like launch at the beginning of the quarter and 2 months into the quarter and then like start again the next quarter. So you have kind of like this standard training cadence that your learners are used to. And there's a little bit more consistency rather than like each training having a wild, inconsistent deadline that might be hard for learners to remember. Alana, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, only thing I would add on top of everything that Lauren just shared, is just that we have found what you might expect out of like the normal patterns of human behavior to be true when it comes to deadlines, which is that regardless of the days and the deadlines that you choose, most learners are completing their training at the very beginning when the training launches and at the very end when the deadline's approaching. And I think that's just kind of a funny universal truth that whether you're giving someone 30 days or 90 days or 100 days, typically we're finding that like the heat is between the very beginning and at the very end. And to that point, I think there is a big emphasis that we put on deadline selection. Not only like, do you want a 30-day deadline? When do you want to launch? But also, what are the implications of that 30-day deadline? So what date is that 30-day deadline is going to fall on? Is it going to fall on spring break? Is it going to fall on the time that perf reviews are starting? Like where is your team's attention going to be during that really critical period where we know a lot of people are going to end up resuming their training just because of like the human nature of how deadlines work?
Any ways to combat the beginning and end syndrome? Like, it would be great if there were consistency, although perhaps it doesn't matter.
I think that the best things that we've seen are the reminder notifications, which do tend to catch a pretty significant population, and then having more specific manual levers. So maybe reaching out to all managers in the middle of the deadline period to say, hey, have you been bringing this up with your teams during one-on-ones? And we have templates like that we sent our admins to send out, or doing that kind of remove or replace, not add tactic of adding in a work block for folks to do their training toward the very beginning or toward the middle, just so that you're front loading some of that completion prior to the very end.
Yeah, and this comms plan, which is just an example from some of our resources, sort of helps to illustrate how we like to think about that, right? Like there are obviously pre-launch communications so that people know the training is coming, but you'll also want to send out a reminder maybe a week after launch just to say like, hey, in case you haven't forgotten, or in case you're ignoring those automated notifications, this is a thing that needs to be done. And just picking those up more and more as you get closer and closer to your
Do you
deadline.
all do that? Do you all do that for your customers? Like try to follow that what timeline they're kind of focused on and give them a nudge. I don't know if you're in a shared Slack with them or you're able to kind of say as a friendly, hey, it's been out, X time period. Here, yeah, here's this communications template. Do you do that for people?
Totally, yeah. We'll have like our post-launch, so we'll have our implementation calls where we're recommending comms plans. We'll have monthly check-ins where we'll say, hey, where are things at? Here's it's interesting to see your data right here. Here's a template we would recommend. And then our post-launch check-in where we say, okay, here's where you are relative to your deadline. Here are some very targeted engagement strategies, and here are some specific templates that you can use for each of the populations that may or may not have completed yet. Essentially, we just try to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, it seems
There's
that way.
so much going on in our admin's
That
lives.
way. I want to encourage people to drop questions in the Q&A. We've got like 15 minutes or so left, so please feel free to drop any questions. We can have as much Q&A as we'd like, and happy to answer. These folks are happy to answer anything, I'm sure. Lauren, what's the hardest? This is just a wondering of my own. What's the hardest implementation that you've had and why?
That's a great question. I think implementations get more complicated the more stakeholders there are. That's really like the key driver. So essentially just having like too many cooks in the kitchen who are potentially not aligned, right? If they're all on the same page and have the same goal, whether it be launching as soon as possible or making sure the content is on brand as possible, then it can be okay. But when you have a lot of kind of disparate stakeholders who maybe aren't aligned internally on what their key metrics are and key goals are, that can be tough. So what we'll try to do in that situation is kind of bring everyone into the same room and get some alignment on like, hey, you're launching these 3 courses. You all want 3 different dates. You want 3 different types of notifications going out to your learners. Like, how can we help you consolidate these? And what's the end goal for the team? And kind of help everyone work toward that, to make sure things go as smoothly as possible. And just to make sure, right, like everyone has visibility into what's going on. I think as Athena's course library grows, and I imagine this is true of like many other training platforms that you may use, the more and more trainings that you have hosted on there, like the more and more people have access and might be changing things. So we want to make sure that we're kind of like a unifying force for that and helping you all be strategic about your training program rather than just going with like that chaos model, which can overwhelm admins and especially overwhelm learners.
Alana, what made so similar question related to what Lauren just said? What
But
what what makes a customer situation more difficult? I'm not going to say what makes the customer difficult because that's that's a ludicrous premise anyway. But what could make a customer's particular situation more difficult
Mm.
and sort of a longer road?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly what Lauren's mentioned around alignment. I think also urgency in terms of like, we need to launch this training right away because there's a new regulation, but we're also working toward, a consolidated rollout plan across the whole organization. And how do we balance those things? So I think something can kind of like feel like a longer road potentially, as we're thinking of how to like balance urgency with consolidation, or thinking about how to have more of a coordinated comms perspective. Should there be disparate teams who have disparate needs? As we go kind of into larger enterprise, I think there tend to be more steps for approval needed, like working with an internal comms manager in order to send out your communications versus an SMB, probably a little easier to draft something out and send it out to the whole
Yeah.
population. So I think those kind of like layers of approval can certainly cause delays, though we do our best to combat those.
Yeah. That sounds sort of just generally enterprise.
Yeah.
Which we know. All right, another question in the Q&A here. This I like this one. What's the best way to reach managers in the manufacturing industry in a small company? That's pretty specific, especially when they roll their eyes at anything new. That's pretty probably non-specific and probably has happened before. Maybe Lauren, you start on this one.
Yeah, definitely. It's tough. Like in some companies, depending on your culture, tougher than others for sure. Like I said before, like some companies know the specific team who might be resistant. Others are like, this is our team. Like they hate all training. They are going to roll their eyes. They're going to have a really hard time with it. We like, having the opportunity to try to combat that. But I think what might be helpful, Alana, if you want to speak a little, we've kind of mentioned this a few times throughout the session, but talk through like what are the kind of like laddering up business consequences of non-compliance for a really critical training. I think like that can often be key in like this is not a fun, fluffy, like just nice to have training. This is really, really crucial to our business.
Totally, yeah. I think that and this goes both for employees and for leadership, frankly, especially as they do play a tough role, but a really important role when there are teams that roll their eyes. And like, look, we know it's compliance training. We know that there will like at least be one eye roll in the bunch. But I think there are components like emphasizing the fact that there are big financial implications to non-completion, or there may be audits that come as a result of non-completion, or there may be like, I don't know, maybe I'm not exactly sure on the specifics of this question, but like warehouse shutdown implications should somebody not complete their training. So like really trying to kind of ground it in reality, even though it is like something that ends up adding to your workload and obviously feeling, frustrating if you had other plans set out for that time period. Trying to kind of like more tactically explain what the implications are of non-completion. It can be
Yeah, I think also as you think about those like example consequences, like specific consequences for your organization that we shared earlier, you can really design those to be as like specific to the objections that you expect to hear from your team as possible. So if you know that your managers are going to be kind of like where the point of conflict is, build your escalation plan around that, right? So any managers who have a team member who hasn't completed their training X days after the deadline is going to have this consequence, and kind of having that built in is a very direct, like kind of individualized per company way to combat something like that.
Do
And on the
people do?
flip side, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alon. Go ahead.
I was gonna say on the flip side, I know we're talking about all like the negative consequences, but from a positive side, we have some customers who have like internal badging systems or like point systems for like doing something impactful within their organization or like early completion. Some of our customers actually use those as drivers, like positive drivers for completion to say, if you complete by, 15 days within launch or by the deadline, you'll earn a badge within our internal system. So I think consequences and like drivers can both be really effective.
You actually just went where I was going, which is what about rewards? My last company before this company was a gifting company, and it was focused on sales and marketing lead generation, more more in the SaaS and B2B space, so more so focused on kind of marketing automation and getting meetings. But we also had a lot of customers that utilized gifting for internal reasons, internal programs. Has anyone paired a gifting solution with this?
So far, I've only seen more kind of like badging, or like the glory of the team that has gotten to finish first, getting like a spotlight on the all hands or something like that. I haven't seen the physical gifts, Lauren. I
It
don't
is
know.
glorious. It is glorious.
It sure
Yeah,
is.
I've actually, it's fun. I've seen it more in past companies where you're dealing with more optional training where it's like, hey, activate your license and start exploring and working on your personal development. And that has been more of like the trigger for rewards. But I think you're exactly right, Andy, that like there's no reason that compliance training shouldn't be treated in the same way. So, like a thought that comes to mind, which is similar to campaigns that I've run in past roles, is like anyone who, like, let's say it's a 60-day deadline, anyone who completes their training within the first week or within the first month is entered in a raffle to win some swag or a gift card, or potentially if you do have one of those like kind of work human style like point systems, it could be like everyone who completes within the first week or the first 10 people to complete get 100 rewards points that you can then like use in the shop. I think those are really cool ideas that are honestly underutilized with compliance because the focus is so much on like not congrats you got it done, but like hey, you 10 people did not get it done.
Yeah.
Platforms like Workhuman, I think, are doing like pushing stuff like this. Shout out to them, a Massachusetts-based company where I live.
Mhm.
All right,
And
so
one more thing I'll just add there, just because we have a resource for it, which is really cool, is that we do typically see that like there's this like really difficult chunk to get at the very end when you're doing escalation. And we do have a template that we share with our customers for a 2-week compliance push that kind of like gamifies the process, allows you to choose a raffle prize, send out comms, announce it on all hands. So again, kind of like leaning more toward that side of like celebrating the wins or like giving incentives to complete. That's another thing that we've
that's
seen.
awesome. A playbook for that is great.
Yeah.
Any other questions, please drop them in. We've got a few minutes left. There's one on early stage companies, which is near and dear to my heart. So I think it's a good question. When should they start thinking about doing this kind of thing? When you're running really fast, and you all know this, being in a growth company, when you're running so fast, at what point do you need to start thinking this way? Is it sales focused? Is it some other reason? What do you see?
I think we generally just see that like as early as possible, when you have a little bit of bandwidth, is the right time to start. And we kind of, at least within Athena, we have a structure where you can do like a set it and forget it kind of model, where we're just saying like just the basics, harassment prevention. Here's how you upload a CSV of your learners and send it out. Just to kind of like ensure that you're covering your bases from an early standpoint. Where we're seeing folks scale up is usually like as we're entering enterprise, we're seeing, and mid-market, we're seeing like more and more required trainings, I would say. But from harassment prevention standpoint, I think, as early as possible, even though that's a very big answer, is usually really helpful. And especially with Athena, where we can kind of automate all of the tracks so that, someone in California is getting their training every other year versus every year, can kind of like help combat training fatigue, but also like take that off someone's plate because we know folks are running really quickly.
Somebody's asking about, like, relatedly, about understanding the actual requirements. So how do you all keep up with state differences? Harassment is a good example. State differences, privacy has global differences in terms of when you need to do privacy training. There's obviously a bunch of others. How do you keep up, and what resources do you have for people to kind of track?
Yeah, I mean, huge shout out to Brandis, our general counsel, who is just absolutely amazing, and works with our team and additional outside counsel to make sure that we stay ahead of all of these details so that we can share those with you. And in terms of resources, like for example, California came out with a new workplace violence regulation to train folks by July 1st. We will do things like create blog posts that have like the TLDR and then all of the kind of more specific details of what a new regulation looks like. We'll do webinars like these, where we'll bring Brandis onto a webinar to talk more specifically about the new regulation. And then we'll also push out comms to our existing customers and to the kind of Athenaverse as it is, to share anything new coming up the pipeline. And that's a big piece, I think, of where we stand and like really hope to support our community and our customers, is kind of like staying on top of those evolving changes so that you don't have to, as we know, there are many things on your plate.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this as a general counsel of a growth company multiple times over. As important as it is, in some circumstances, it isn't necessarily always the top thing because of sales and mostly sales in the early going, right? You're really focused on revenue, and what happens is compliance collides with revenue, and your ability to get into the door of an important customer will collide with requirements for revenue, SOC 2, training, all sorts of things. So your point is a good one. When it's time, it's really helpful to have people with other resources that can help you kind of directionally focus on the areas that should come first. And I don't want to spend $1,000 an hour to go to an outside counsel to get this analysis done when the initial answer should be do some harassment training. Like that should be step one in any company of really any size.
Totally.
Yeah.
In the last couple minutes here, just on the note of incentives, I wanted to throw up this slide from our team, sharing an opportunity to win a $50 gift card if you share a little LinkedIn post about what you learned from today's workshop. So feel free to go do that at your leisure. And on Friday, we'll select one person to win a gift card either from Amazon, Uber, or DoorDash.
Good choices. Any other questions from anybody before we wrap, or anything that we've missed? Alana, Lauren, if you want to, any points we missed talking about? We're close to the end here, but we have a minute or two.
I want to give a shout out for Peter's comment here, and I know we're
Yeah.
a little beyond that topic now, but I think that that's a really great point as it pertains to kind of making things more tactical for your employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like Alana and I know, and I think Athena overall, we're all about just like reducing friction on the admin side and on the learner side. So I think like as you think about rolling out any sort of training, engaging people to help reach that magical 100% compliance benchmark, making sure you're doing that wherever possible, right? Reducing friction for your learners, reducing friction for your managers or team leads who you're trying to help get your learners to that point. And I know our goals as the customer success team are really to reduce that friction for you as the admin who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting often. So thank you all for that.
Thank you all. Sounds like you're doing it. A lot of the ratings in here are improving. The 1 to 5 are improving based on use of Ethena. So the hope here is to move those 5s to 3s and 2s and 1s and make it easy. So thank you for what you all are doing for your customers and future customers out there, and really supporting. I love what Athena's doing too.
And thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.